Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Non Bet, Itmar. Matenat Shechi Mera, Shekatub Ba Kinyan, Berav Misheme Derav Amri, Arkebe Atere Richshe. Ushmuel Amar, Layadana Mai Adun Ba. We have a machloket here about a case of someone who was on his deathbed. We already learned. Someone who was on his deathbed does not have to make an official kinyan, doesn't have to do an act of transaction, but rather orally he can just say, I want to give this to this person and that to that person, and then we fulfill his words. Once he dies, then that in fact goes through. However, in this case, he's on his deathbed and he also made a kinyan. So they have a document written, a deed, that says in it, this person said field A should go to Mr. Friedman. And he made a kinyan. The kinyan might be any type of kinyan. It could be a kinyan chalipin, that he received a handkerchief and through that concretized the gift that he's going to give to Mr. Friedman. Or it could be with a shtar. He wrote up a deed and he said, give this deed to that person. So here's the problem. The fact that he did two things, does that make it stronger or weaker? So that's the machloket here. In the Bet Midrash, they said in the name of Rav that he mounted two steeds, two horses, meaning he gave it extra strength. Number one, he's on his deathbed. And so the oral statement, that works by itself. And second, he also did a kinyan. Now this is an extra strong one. That makes sense. Shmuel, however, says, I don't know how to rule with this. See, the thing is, if he does the second, the kinyan, does that show that he actually wants this to be transferred through that transaction and not through his deathbed oral statement? And so perhaps the second thing is undoing the first one. And there's also a problem with only using the second one, as we're about to explain. Berav mishmed Rav Amre, arkebe atere richshe, harehi kematenat bari, harehi kematenat shechib mera. So in the Bet Midrash, they said in the name of Rav, that it's like mounting two steeds. It's like, connecting your chariot to two horses. So it's extra strong, has double strength, and it has the strength of a gift that's given by a healthy person, as well as the strength of a gift given by someone on his deathbed. How so? Harehi kematenat bari, shimamad eno hozer. It's like a gift of a healthy person in that even if he gets better, he cannot change his mind. So this would be talking about a case where he gave away all of his property. He left nothing for himself, which, if he didn't make an extra kinyan, and he gave away all of his property, once he gets better, he can take it back, because it's evident that he only gave it away because he was going to die, but if he gets better, he can take it back. However, according to Rav, if he gives an oral statement, and he also does a kinyan chalipin, then it's a permanent gift. So that has the strength of a gift given by a healthy person. And and it has the strength of someone on his deathbed that, let's say he says, I want to transfer my loan to someone else. He has an oral loan. If it's written in a deed, you could give someone the deed. But if it's an oral loan, then the only way to transfer it to someone else is, as we saw, b'ma'amad sheloshtan, if the lender and the borrower and the third party that should be able to now to collect the loan, the lender is going to give it over to the third party. If all three people are there, then you can do it or by a statement of all three people being there. However, barring that, there's no way to transfer unless someone is on his deathbed. Someone on his deathbed who's owed money can say, the money that is owed to me by Mr. A, I want my friend over here, Mr. Friedman, that he should be able to collect it. That's something that someone on his deathbed can do, even without the people all there, which a healthy person cannot do. So therefore, by doing this in two ways, an oral statement on his deathbed, and also making a kinyan, it has the strength of each of these. Independently would have, this has the strength of both of them together. That's the opinion of Rav. Ushmuel amar le'adana may adun ba shema lo gamar laktoto ela bishtar ve'en shetar le'achar mita. Shmuel says, I don't know how to judge this case because perhaps, even though he's on his deathbed, the fact that he made a kinyan Let's say he made a kinyan with a deed. He said, here, take this deed to my field and give it to that person. And so because he's doing it with a deed, perhaps in his mind, he's thinking that I only want the field to be transferred through the deed and not with my oral statement as a person on his deathbed. And the problem with the deed, however, is that you cannot give over a deed after the person dies. And so if he has in mind that, I'm on my deathbed, you know what? I want this to be transferred through a deed. But since he's on his deathbed, he's thinking, well, I only want to be transferred after I die. Generally, a gift of a shchib merah only takes effect right after he dies. Let's say he says an oral statement, right? Give this to that person. It doesn't go now. It only goes after he dies. So the person might be thinking, here's this deed, or he does a kinyan chalipin, and he's thinking, okay, I'm going to do this kinyan now, but I should be transferred after the actual transfer should happen after I die. Well, since he's thinking that, so then actually no transaction happens at all because he's doing the kinyan. So that means he doesn't want the oral statement to take effect, and because this kinyan he's having in mind that it should take effect after he dies, and you can't do a kinyan after you die. So then it ends up being nothing. And even if he dies, no transfer happens. That, whatever he said, this field should go to my friend Mr. Friedman, nothing happens, nothing goes there. Instead, all of his estate will go to the heirs according to the normal order of how heirs inherit, as the opinion of Shemuel. Okay, very interesting machloket. Now we're going to quote a source where it seems that Rav and Shemuel say the opposite of what they just said here. We're going to raise a contradiction of Rav against another statement that Rav said, and Shemuel against another statement that Shemuel said. Dishlach Rabin Mishmeh de Rabbi Abhu. Hevu Yad'ed Sheshalach Rabbi Elazar Lagola Mishum Rabenu. Rabin said in the name of Rabbi Abhu, he sent a message with the following statement. You should know that Rabbi Elazar, who lived in Eretz Yisrael, sent to Bavel the following halacha in the name of our teacher. Our teacher here meaning is Rav. So all this is in the name of Rav, who said, Shechib merah she'amar kitvu utnu maneh leploni umet en kotvin venotnin shema lo gamar laknoto ela bishtar ve'en shetar lachar mita. So Rav says, if someone is on his deathbed and he said, write down and give a deed of a gift to this person, and then he died before they got a chance to actually write it down and give it to that person, we do not follow through with his command. We do not write it and give it. Why? Because if he said nothing, if he didn't say to write it down, if it was just an oral statement and he said, this field I want to be a gift to that person, and then he died, we would give it, because that's the law of Shechib merah, that you follow his oral statement. However, because he said, write it down and give it, we assume that he didn't want it to be transferred by his oral statement, but rather he had in mind that it should only be transferred through a deed. The thing is that they didn't give him the deed while the guy was alive, and you can't give a deed on behalf of someone after the person dies, and therefore there is no transaction. You see that this statement of Rav is kind of like what Shemuel said earlier, and against Rav earlier said, if you do two things, Shechib merah, and you do a kinyan, double good. So it's for sure good. And here he's saying, no, the oral statement isn't good because he didn't have in mind to use that, and the deed isn't good because it's after death, and now there's nothing at all. So Rav is contradicting himself. However, Rav Yehuda quotes the name of Shemuel regarding this exact case, that halacha is that we do write it and we do give it. Which is contradiction to what Shemuel said before. Shemuel said before that if he does an oral statement and he also does an act of a transaction, then both are no good and we don't do anything at all. And yet here, which seems to be the same case, Shemuel saying, yes, you give it, which sounds like you're accepting that it's an oral statement, and so the transaction goes through, and so therefore, since it's going through, you can go ahead and you can give. the shtad also, even after death. They'll have that as proof. So Shemuel here is contradicting what he said before. So Kashya de Rav ad Rav, Kashya de Shmuel ad Shmuel. So we have a contradiction for both sages. Let's answer for both of them. De Rav ad Rav la Kashya ha de kanumine, ha de la kanumine. There's no contradiction between the two statements of Rav. The first statement of Rav is when they actually made a kinyan. The guy's on his deathbed and he says, okay, give me that handkerchief, and then through taking this handkerchief, I am transferring this field to Mr. Friedman. So he actually made a kinyan while he was alive. Or if it was a deed, he actually gave the deed while he was alive. And he also said an oral statement. Because he did both things, that makes it extra strong. And in that case, even if he gets better, even if he gave away everything and he gets better, he cannot take it back because he did the kinyan and he also did the oral thing. And so even if it was a loan, the loan goes, which only a shchib merah can do. So it has the strength of both. That's the first statement he said. The second statement is when they did not actually make a kinyan. That's he's on his deathbed. He said to two witnesses, listen, I want you both to go write a deed and give it to him. But they didn't do it. So there was no actual kinyan done while the guy was alive. Since there was no kinyan done, and it seems like he was relying on that kinyan, so now you have no oral statement and no kinyan was actually done, and you can't do a kinyan after he dies. So Rav was talking about two different scenarios. And we can resolve the contradiction between the two statements of Shemuel. The second statement is when he makes it clear that he wants the deed, the document, only to enhance the legal power of the recipient, who will now have a deed that can be a proof that the gift is in fact his. So that's different from the first case. The first case, he didn't say this is going to be a proof for enhancing the power of the recipient. He didn't say anything like that. He just said, I want this gift to go to that person, and he does a kinyan right now. Since he does a kinyan, so that means suggests that he doesn't want it to transfer by his oral statement of a shchib merah, and he has in mind also that he's doing this kinyan, even if he's doing it now, but he wants it to only take effect after he dies, because he really owns that, because that's generally what shchib merah does. So now you're mixing and matching. A shchib merah can have something transfer after he dies with an oral statement. That's a special law of shchib merah, but you can't do the same thing without an oral statement with a transaction, because then that transaction doesn't work like that if you're actually doing a transaction. So he's doing a transaction, so the oral statement doesn't apply because he's relying on the transaction, not the oral statement. On the other hand, the transaction, he's relying on it happening after he dies, and it can't happen after he dies. So that's why in that case, nothing happens at all. However, if he makes a statement that says, listen, I want you to give this field to that person. It's an oral statement. So we accept the oral statement. And then he says, in order to give the person more power, in case anybody ever questions it, I want you to go and write a deed as proof of it. So then it's clear that the deed is only meant as proof, only there to enhance the power, to add extra strength to it, but is not meant to undo the oral statement or cancel that out. And that's the case of Shemuel. So Shemuel is also talking about two different cases. Okay, it's good. It's good we had this contradiction, because through it we can understand the fine distinctions between similar cases, but that have important differences between them. Now a story. Yetev Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak achore de Rava. V'yetev Rava kamed Rav Nachman ka ba'e mineh. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is sitting behind Rava in the classroom. That means Rava was a more advanced student than Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. The further back in the classroom you are, that means the lesser of a student. So Rava is himself in the front row. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is like, his Rava is like lower than Rava in the second row, and they are sitting before Rav Nachman, who is the teacher, who is teaching them. And Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question. Mi amar Shemuel, Shema lo gamar laknoto ela bishtar ve'en shetar lachar mita. Is it true that Shemuel really said that if someone on his deathbed says, I'm going to do a kinyan, that the oral statement is no good and the kinyan is no good, because maybe he has in mind that he doesn't want it to be transferred by his oral statement, but only by the deed, by the shtar. And you can't give a shtar after death, and therefore there's no transaction at all. Did Shmuel really say that? Here's the problem. The problem is that Rav Yehuda said the name of Shemuel. Someone on his deathbed that said, write down, I want to give all my property to other people. So he gave away all of his property. And Shemuel said, even if they make a kinyan. So now he did the oral statement. He said, go give it everything away, and he said, go, write it in a will. And he also made a kinyan, and then he got better. He can take it back. Why can he take it back? Because it's clear that he only did that kinyan, even though he did a kinyan chalipin or with a deed, even though he did a kinyan, he only did that because he thought he was going to die. So it was a conditional statement, it was a conditional kinyan. And therefore, if he gets better, he can take it back. So here's the problem. What if he dies? So that means he only can get it back if he gets better. But if he dies, then the gift goes to that person, right? He said, I want field A to go to Mr. Friedman. He makes a kinyan chalipin, right? And that it should, by taking this handkerchief, then the field goes to Mr. Friedman. So, according to the second statement, if he gets better, then he can take it back. But if he dies, then Mr. Friedman gets it. The problem is that contradicts the first statement, because the first statement says if you do both things, an oral statement and also a kinyan, then they cancel each other out. Because the oral statement means by doing a kinyan, you're undoing the oral statement. It means I didn't want the oral statement, and the kinyan cannot work after death, and so it doesn't go at all. And so according to the first statement of Shemuel, if the guy dies, Mr. Friedman won't get it. It'll go to the natural heirs. According to the second statement, when he dies, Mr. Friedman does get it. Okay, good question. So Rava asked Rav Nachman this question. Rav Nachman didn't give a verbal answer. He made a hand gesture, some kind of hand gesture, and Rava was silent, meaning he accepted it, he understood it. He answered somehow with charades. Now, Rav Nachman, so when they finished the lesson before Rav Nachman, then Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, they're both Rav Nachman, the teacher in the front and the student behind Rava are both Rav Nachman. But Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, so when he finished, he asked, well, what happened? Kikam, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak le Rava, Mai achvi lach. So Rava understood the gesture, but Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak in the back row didn't understand it. So he asked Rava, what did he show you? What did he do that you got the answer? Amar le b'miapet kocho. So Rava answered, what he told me is, we're talking about a case of someone who was made clear that he wants to enhance the legal power. So maybe we could figure out what the hand gesture was, some kind of hand gesture of power. He went like this, right, to give extra power. That's the second statement of Rava, is where it's clear that he did something for extra power, meaning the same answer that we had over here to respond to the contradiction between the two statements of Shemuel. That's what Rav Nachman told Rava. So, in other words, this first statement that we quoted the name of Shemuel, where he does an oral statement and he also does a kinyan, so then nothing happens because he did the kinyan. That shows he didn't want the oral statement to work, and you can't make a kinyan after death, because if he has in mind, it's only going to take effect after death. So therefore, nothing goes. If he dies, then that field will not go to Mr. Friedman at all. However, the second statement is talking about a case where he said it in a way that he says, listen, I want to give all this property to Mr. Friedman. And then he says, I am going to add power to that by making a kinyan. So because he made it clear in some way that the kinyan is only there to strengthen the oral statement, in that case, Shemuel agrees that when if he dies, the statement, and then it goes through. The gift is in fact a gift because it works by the oral statement that he made. Oral statement of Shechit Mera is good, and the kinyan was only there to bolster it. So even though there's no kinyan after death, the kinyan is not undoing the oral statement, but only adding to it. And so now we explain what mi'apeh kocho means. What is an example of a case of someone who is clearly enhancing the power of the recipient? Amar Rav Chisda v'kaneh namine mosif al matanta dam. We're talking about where it says in the deed that the witnesses say, we acquired it from him, meaning we did a kinyan, mosif, in addition to the gift that he said orally. So because they're saying the word mosif here, right? It's not clearly not instead of. They didn't say, instead of giving a gift orally, we did a kinyan. No, if you write this statement, if the witnesses write the statement, then it's clear that the guy in his deathbed did not want the kinyan to replace an oral statement. He wanted the oral statement. I want to give this gift, and that works by itself. And then mosif, he wants to add on to the matena, the oral gift, v'kebekanena, and we also made a physical kinyan in order to add to that. So since he's adding to that, that just makes it stronger. And in that case, when he dies, the gift does, in fact, go through. Next statement. Peshita, katab leze v'chatab leze. Hainu dechi ata Rav Dimi amar, daitike mebatelet daitike. So here's a simple case. Someone is on his deathbed and he commanded the people, he said a statement, right, I want all my property to go to the Reuven. And then afterwards he says, right, that all my property should go to Shimon. In that case, we know the answer. This is exactly what Rav Dimi said. When he came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said, daitiki, meaning a will. One will can nullify a previous will. In other words, a person on his deathbed, he can change his mind anytime he wants. As long as he's alive, the transfer does not actually happen until after he's dead. And therefore, while he's alive, if at night he says, I want to give everything to Reuven, and says, and then he says, go write that down. And then in the morning he says, I want to give everything to Shimon, we assume he changed his mind, and then Shimon does get everything. That's a simple case. Here's the more complicated case. Katav v'zika leze, Rav amar rishon kana, Ushmuel amar sheni kana. If he gave a directive, he wants to give everything to Reuven, and furthermore, he did some kind of transaction. He actually merited that Reuven should get it by giving him a deed or whatever he did. And so that seems like a finalized transaction. And then afterwards, the next morning, he did the same for Shimon. What about now? Does the second one nullify the first, or we follow the first? So Rav says we follow the first, which is consistent with what we just saw above, where Rav says, if you do two things, then they strengthen each other. You give an oral gift and you also make a kinyan, then that's for sure a gift. So that means the first one, it's given to him. He did an oral transaction, which is true, will only take effect after he dies. But he also did a kinyan, and the kinyan is its own separate transaction that takes effect, and therefore that's it. He gave it away to one person. It's like a bari. Rav actually said that. It's like a healthy person who gives something away. Once you give a gift to one person, then that's it. You can't take it back and you can't give it to anybody else. Whereas Shemuel says in this case that it's the second guy that gets it. And this is consistent with what Shemuel said earlier, because he said earlier, if someone on his deathbed does two things, he gives an oral statement and he also does a kinyan, then it does not work, because that shows he didn't want the oral statement to take effect because he did a kinyan, and the kinyan doesn't take effect until after he dies. And you can't do a kinyan after you die. And so therefore, nothing happens at all. And so that would be actually similar, not exactly the same as in this case. In this case, Shemuel says the second one does get it. Really, if we were following the first one, it should be that nobody gets it. So therefore, the commentaries here say it must be that when he gave it to Reuven at night, he did the two, he did orally, and he also did a kinyan, and therefore they canceled. Neither of them work, and so nobody gets it. And then in the morning, when they did it again, this time he did it. He said, I want the kinyan to be liapot kocho, to give strength to the oral statement. So that means, that's why the one in the morning actually does work, but the one at night is the one that doesn't work at all, which is consistent with what he said earlier. Rav amar rishon kana, harehi kematenat bari, ushmel amar sheni kana, harehi kematenat shechi mera. And here's explanation for their positions. Rav says that the first one gets it because this is like a gift of a healthy person. Healthy person who gives a gift, he gives it to Reuven, that's it, he can't take it back. And so because, even though he's on his deathbed, but he did a kinyan, so then the kinyan takes effect. Whereas Shmuel says the second one gets it because it's like the Shechib Mera, who can change his mind anytime he wants to. And therefore the first thing that he did, even if we would recognize the oral statement, still he could change his mind. And the kinyan that he did, we assume he meant that it should take effect only after he dies. And therefore, the first one does not take effect. And then when he gives it to the second one, and he has in mind that this one should really work, and the kinyan should strengthen the oral statement, then the second one does work. Good. Now, here's a question. Wait a second. Why do we need this to record this controversy between Rav and Shemuel? After all, we already recorded it right above when we were talking about the gift of a Shechib Mera, where it says in the document that the witnesses write up, and it says that this person, he said he wants to give this field to someone else, and he also did a kinyan. He did a kinyan chalipin. So we already also there the machloka between Rav and Shemuel, and we understand their position. So why do we have to say it again over here? And the answer is Siricha. Di'itmar beha ka'amar Rav, mishum dekanu mineh, aval beha de la kanu mineh, ema modele lishmuel. So I might have thought in the first case, that's where Rav says that it is the first one is a totally valid transaction, because they did a transaction kanu mineh, which typically refers to kinyan chalipin. So I might say kinyan chalipin is something that someone means and wants to take effect right now. Whereas in this machloket over here, it doesn't say that they did a kinyan chalipin. It says zika, which sounds like he granted some kind of document to him. And the document is more ambiguous than a kinyan chalipin, because the document might mean this is just a proof for that you will get it, or this is something that will take effect. This document will take effect only after he dies. So really, you might have thought that there's a distinction, and that in such a case he really is relying on the oral statement, and the deed that he says zika here, this I'm meriting this to you through this deed, maybe that's just a proof, or maybe that's something that should only happen after he dies. And so therefore I might have thought that Rav would say if he then gives it to someone else, then he can change his mind. And he would agree with Shemuel. So that's why I need Rav to teach me this. Even in the second case, it doesn't matter whether that does kinyan chalipin or he grants him a deed. Either way, that's considered something that doubles down on his commitment, and so we have a double commitment, and he cannot change his mind from the person he gave it to first. And if I only had the second statement, which is regarding a deed, I would say that's where Shemuel says that since this is a deed that he's giving him, that may be only something that he means for it to happen after he dies. Maybe it's only a proof of it. So therefore, here Shemuel says he can change his mind, because when he gives it to Reuven, even though he's giving him a deed, he might think that the deed is only a proof, or only something that should take effect after he dies, and it's really the oral statement that he's relying on, and therefore he can change his mind. Since it's Shechib Mera's oral statement, he can change his mind anytime while he's alive. And so maybe Shemuel says he changed his mind in this case. But in the case where he does a kinyan chalipin, the earlier case, I might have thought that he agrees with Rav, that the kinyan chalipin is in fact a final and legitimate gift. And that's why I need the first one also to say, not so, since he did a kinyan, even though he did a kinyan chalipin, we assume that means he's not relying on the oral statement, and he wants the kinyan chalipin to happen only after death, but it cannot happen after death. So that's why I need both of these statements. Besura matnu hachi. What we just saw above was how they taught this law in Surah. However, Bepumbedita Matnu Hachi, they have a different version of Shemuel's law in Pupedita. Amar Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba shedachule mebe Rav le Shmuel. They sent, you see, the words mebe Rav comes up a lot, and it can be translated as the house of Rav, meaning a study hall of the Amora Rav. But I think more often it means the study hall of the rabbi, whoever the rabbi is. Okay, so anyway, either way, they sent from the study hall to Shemuel. מדנו רבנו, שכי מרע שכתב כל נכסיו לאחרים וקנו מידו מהו. What if someone on his deathbed commands that they should write that all of his property should go to these other people, and they also do a kinyan? So what is the law? Does that kinyan help out, or does it actually nullify the gift entirely? Shelach lehu en achar kinyan kelum. And he sent back, once you do an act of acquisition, then nothing can change it. The act of acquisition is final. So this must be talking about a case where it's clear that the act of acquisition is meant to strengthen what he said orally, and therefore the idea is that he cannot take it back. This gives extra strength to it, and that's it. Once he gives it, it's done. Now, when they heard that answer, the students thought that what he meant is that if the guy in his deathbed gives everything to someone else, gives everything to Reuven, and then he wants to change his mind and give it to Shimon, he cannot do so. He cannot change and give it to someone else. But what if he wants to take it back for himself? So they thought maybe in that case he can. He can always change his mind and take it back for himself. Amar lehu Rav Chisda ki ata Rav Huna mikufre Persha ben lasmo ben la'acherim. However, Rav Chisda said that when Rav Huna came from Kufre, he said this following explanation in the name of Shemuel, that it doesn't matter whether he's taking it back for himself or taking it back to give to others. It does not work. If he only said an oral statement, then of course, yes, he can change his mind. But if he said an oral statement and he made a kinyan, then he cannot change his mind because he made a kinyan, not for himself and not for others. And finally, a quick story. Hahu dekanu mine atale kamed Rav Huna amar ma'i bidlach dela aknet kid maknu inashe. You had a certain person who was on his deathbed, and he wrote a deed granting everything to other people, and he made an acquisition also for it. Dekanu mine. So he made an acquisition. And then he wanted to take it back. He wanted to change his mind. So they brought the case to Rav Huna. And Rav Huna says, I can't help you. What can I do for you? You did not transfer the way people normally do on their deathbed. Normally, someone on his deathbed just says a statement, and then that's it. So when you say a statement, then you could change your mind as long as you're alive. Then I could have given it back to you. But you didn't do the normal thing. You added extra. You did a kinyan. And by doing a kinyan, you made your gift a final gift, and therefore I cannot help you get it back. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.